Fear! Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. That famous quote by FDR is where we will jump off for today's episode. Sorry for that rather abrupt introduction. Welcome to the Two Existential Dudes podcast. This is episode 8. Today we will be discussing fear.
How you doing?
I also apologize to anyone who may have had to listen to that overly dramatic and cheesy horror soundtrack that I found on YouTube.
Well, everyone knows an informative TV show always starts with a theme song, right?
Well, of course.
Of course.
Now this. Episode 5.
So, as usual, I'll ask you, how do we want to define fear?
Well, that's where I was going with the quote. I was going to... Actually, you should define fear first.
You want me to define it?
Yeah,
okay.
Define it first.
So, in my extensive research, I found that most of the definitions, just like with the love situation, they were very general and vague. I did try to find some categories at least. The overarching one I could find was that fear is a sense of danger or apprehension of something, typically of a threat or a threat in both the physical and psychological sense. This includes both being physically maimed and emotionally maimed, if you will. And thus, I found some helpful categories that we can think of. They were adapted by Dr. Karl Albrecht in his quote "Feararchy," building up from the base.
I would stop you right there because I do want to get to the quote because I promise there was a purpose to that.
Okay.
I didn't want to just quote FDR. We hear the front half of that quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, but I think the second part kind of clarifies what he has to say because fear can be valuable in that, well, on the most basic level, it's what keeps us alive. But what he's mostly referring to, quote, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, that's what he means when we should fear that kind of fear, irrational fear. And I don't know, what word do you think you would use to distinguish those two? Or is that something you have? Or
Those two?
Yeah, justified fear versus irrational fear.
Oh, so yeah, justified fear is immediate danger or danger you know of. Such, I guess you could say the fear of the known as opposed to the unknown, more commonly known. But in this case, like, the valid fear that you know of already is that of you're in danger immediately, you're at risk of something, or you're at risk of, say, being embarrassed to that extent, while an irrational fear is not knowing, if you will. This is where the famous fear of the unknown comes in, the apprehension, the weariness and paranoia.
I would say irrational fear, the perfect example of that is people's fear of, say, shark attacks or something like that, when statistically you're more likely to be killed by your refrigerator or your toaster or something absurd like that.
Yeah, I think the stats always use like you're more likely to be struck by lightning usually, which is the case.
Which is also
incredibly unlikely. Yes, so that's where I wanted to bring in the different types of these physical fears that you can think of. Thinking from like base fundamental fears, if you're familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those kind of each of those layers has a fear, if you will, that is associated with it. In this case, extinction, which is being annihilated.
I think it's helpful with that to go over the hierarchy of needs. So at the bottom, the most basic level, you have what are called physiological needs. These are the things you need to survive: water, food.
Physical, nothing
Yeah.
psychological yet.
The next step up is safety. This would include things like shelter, protection.
There's another one.
Anything to add?
There's always more there.
I'm
That one can be more general because it does include like safety in a home and food and having things accessible to you, as compared to having those things in you at the moment of the first level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Number 3.
The third level is belonging. I guess you would say it's love and belonging. This would be the feeling of almost having a purpose in a community.
Yeah.
This is the level that society fills. This is what church communities fill. This is schools for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth level is esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And
feeling like you're valuable.
Yeah.
Self-esteem is the case.
Even though I have some aversions to
That's a separate. Not today. Not today.
Okay. I got it.
That's a 3-hour-long discussion.
Got it. And then the higher one, which we have talked about before, is self-actualization, which is basically discovering your main purpose in life and working towards that.
Yes. Yeah, so the whole Maslow was part of a group of psychologists known as the humanists, in this idea of not necessarily of just actions and thoughts, but of potential in the person, which is why the peak of the pyramid and the hardest part to get is that highest potential and self-actualization that you want to be at the highest level, as compared to the physical needs, which can be associated with some other psychological fields such as behaviorism and such, where those are based on your behavior, hence their name.
Okay, so you were about to relate the hierarchy of human needs to fears.
Yes.
So take it away.
Yeah, and they don't all match exactly, but just for rule of argument, the first one is extinction, and that can be associated with your psychological needs. If you don't exist, well, that's an issue for your physiological needs. Sorry. The second level is mutilation, which is another great word. It is the they're great.
You didn't come up.
No,
okay.
I'm not that smart. This guy's a PhD. It's fine. But this mutilation, of course, is the loss of some arm or leg or such. This can be, to a degree, associated with safety, in that you want to know that you won't lose an arm somehow.
Yeah.
I would suppose. After that is loss of autonomy, which can be... This one, I think, is related to both your mind and your body, in that loss of autonomy can be being paralyzed physically, such as FDR, actually, but also being controlled by someone, if you will.
So if you were going to relate, if I was going to relate these to a level in the pyramid, I would say losing physical autonomy or agency would fall into safety, and losing other forms of agency would fall into probably esteem or love and belonging.
Yeah, the middle of this chart doesn't line up as well with that one.
Yeah.
I best understood this as the basic fears and the physical fears to the complex fears, such as the things that happen in your head. And you'll see what I mean as we go through the rest of them. The next two are safety, and then separation, and then what's called ego death, which I termed as humiliation. Which those two particularly are much more about the social aspect of it, as opposed to the three prior, which are the entirely physical, really. Aside from the loss of autonomy, which is an argument to be made there.
So, since that is such a complex fear, humiliation, and you would think it wouldn't be on, say, the forefront of people's minds, but a lot of times that's what people are most afraid of. I would cite the statistic that public speaking is the number one fear. Like, I once heard Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian, make the joke that if someone had to be at a funeral, they would rather be in the casket than reading the eulogy, because death is the number 2 fear.
Absolutely.
And public speaking is number 1.
Yeah, well, realistically, for most countries today, we have a society in which we don't have to fear extinction, nor mutilation, nor, aside from medical issues, loss of autonomy, even separation. Aside from right now, we can still get into a community if we choose to. If we don't succeed in that, that's our own fault, but it's not the world working against us. And really all that leaves is that internal notion.
And I would say that, yeah, those other things are almost guaranteed in our modern society. Even things like autonomy, where we live in a pretty free society, and that you can say or do most anything that you want without fear of legal repercussions or social ostracism.
Yeah.
But that humility, just the thought of people losing respect for you, that often is the most prevalent for us.
In my own personal experience, I think much more about how people will regard me than mutilation or an extinction. I don't think about that unless I'm playing like Fallout or something, then that's the point of the game. And if you think about it, then that society doesn't guarantee that those first fears won't happen.
And I suppose then it makes sense that death would be number 2, because you would think, well, if people only see these complex social fears as things worth preoccupying themselves with, then why would death be number 2? But the inevitability of death, and the fact that there's nothing society can do to give you immortality, in a sense, that it makes sense. And that I actually think this is a fantastic segue.
I was about to say. I was literally waiting for you to finish that thought to say that.
To another thing, and you can interject if you have anything on it, but I would say there's something to be said about, while the lack of autonomy is something to be feared, I would say I myself, and as well as other people, fear too much autonomy, too much responsibility, in that if you mess up, it's your own fault, and then you have to live with that. So
yeah, I mean, this goes back all the way back to our goals in first episode, where we talked about for us, both the necessity of having a schedule to facilitate getting things done within that day. Otherwise, we don't do things. We wake up much later than we're supposed to. We don't have good lunches. We don't get practicing or homework done. And then we only feel guilty for that. Yeah. Well, I think this is a great segue in discussing...
Is this a segue on top of a segue?
It is. I'd like to discuss now innate fears versus learned fears, or societal fears. So innate, of course, is internal, intrinsic. I can never get it right. Thank you. These are things, most often you can say injury and like death, usually, because you know to fear death because it's, you're dying. That's pretty straightforward. But then you have things like learned fears, which can be a much more arguable category, I would say.
Yeah.
The first one I wrote in here with a large question mark was religion. Because 100 years ago, most citizens, probably 100, maybe 200 years ago, most citizens would have listed God as their greatest fear. not necessarily fear and as in like fear of destruction, but as in like
yeah,
God fearing the term
Yeah.
usually. In that sense, but today it's public speaking, if you will.
yeah,
It's not that anymore, and I find that interesting in that I wonder, is that just a learned fear, or is that something as humans we recognize this supposed deity and this power here?
mm-hmm.
Is that fear or is that power we should be afraid of, or are we taught to be afraid of it?
Why is that why you put the question? Because
That's why
you wouldn't know what column it would belong in.
Mm-hmm. And then to attach onto that, you could make that a more general category and say authority. Because why really are we respectful and afraid, to a degree, of our government and our authority figures for the most part?
Mm-hmm. I would add on to this that the notion of financial stability is a completely learned fear, in that it has no, at least the money we use in the United States, a fiat system of currency, there is no objective value in the currency. And all the trust, you have to trust that it's worth something and that it's backed by a government that says it's worth something, making the fear of not having it completely learned and arbitrary.
Yeah, and to add a little bit of evidence for you there, the American dollar, technically, in my general understanding of economics, I'm not an economics major by any degree, but effectively it used to be based on gold and then silver and then gold, until it was taken off gold, and now it's based on credit, and thus the dollar is itself. It's not based on anything anymore, which does lead to some fun discussions on the fact that like most of the world is also dependent on the dollar, so most of the world's economy is based on this piece of paper that technically has no value.
Yeah.
And if you're an economics major, please clarify for us any details here, but this is I provide that as evidence to say there is that kind of weird fear, like as humans, finances weren't really something to think about until we had society, and for the vast majority of human history, including like primitive history, there wasn't much society with money.
You didn't think about the money you had. You just thought about the things you had, the things that you could use, the things that you could eat,
Hence why bartering was the primary system.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to the idea of complex versus basic, because long ago, when those were the things we were focused on, my shelter that I built out of wood that I chopped down, the deer that I hunted that I get to eat, the water that I go and get every day, those were the things that people worried about. But now it's become this thing that's not even tangible in most cases, this number that sits in a bank account.
Yeah, especially when it's in this age of digital money, you don't have a physical thing to look at. I've often seen that it's more that when you are spending money, you're more likely to spend more if it's through credit, as opposed to if you're physically handing the money over. Because at that point, you can see how much you're giving away.
Yeah.
And there are some debates to be had about like buying a car with like thousands of wads of cash, which would be ineffective. But even still, you would see how much more you're passing over.
Yeah.
Even though it's really the same amount. And thus, to build on your argument there, in primitive time, money didn't exist, and the most dangerous thing you had to worry about was the boar you're hunting stabbing you. While today, the most dangerous thing we have to worry about stabbing us is maybe the fork at the dinner table, for the most part. Unless you live in Chicago, then God bless you.
I didn't get that.
Highest knife crimes per capita?
Ah.
I think it is. I'm pretty sure. It's either gun crimes or knife crimes. One of the two. Yeah. Don't go to Chicago. It's a nice city, just don't go there after like 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Moving on.
So,
now this, if you will.
That is we need that on a t-shirt. Our t-shirt lists are growing immensely fast.
We have more we have more ideas for slogans on t-shirts than we have viewers.
Yeah, actually, yes, that is a fact. So then to break out of that innate and learned fear, which we might come back to, I like to ask about the fear of the unknown.
This is one that I think encompasses a lot of people's more specific fears. Like, we were with friends the other day, and someone cited that, what was it that they said? Like, someone sneaking up behind you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, like surprise, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the point that we made as a group was that most of our general fears can be categorized into general overarching groups, such that for most people, you're not afraid of the dark.
You're afraid of what's in the... Ooh.
And thus uncertainty or paranoia. And, of course, we can cherry pick categories and make things fit how we want, but a lot of these do fall under these more general categories, and if you don't go all the way up the generalizations but don't stay where you are, you can often find what you're really afraid of.
So would things like that be irrational fears? Fear of the dark, per se?
Yes, because there's no reason telling you to be afraid of that, although you are. And I wouldn't say it's
more inherited from back when we did have to worry about the dark.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say that like a fear of what's in the dark is invalid. It's certainly a valid fear. I won't deny that, but it's not logical, if you will.
Even our editor / my brother,
he's waving at us. Say hi.
Made one of his fears is whenever he's home alone and a car drives by, he can't help but like look out the window while holding a baseball bat.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Well, and it's the same case if you don't really know.
Yeah.
You're kind of uncertain. And that's why the fear of the unknown is so famous, because it's so common as a category. I wrote down apprehension, worry, paranoia, the quote, anything could happen, and an unpredictable notion. It's just not knowing, the unknown.
I think this ties back into what I said about your autonomy can sometimes be the cause of your fears, because when you're making decisions, if you don't know 100% the outcome of such decisions, then there's always an aspect of unknown there. And that could certainly apply to lack of autonomy too.
Yeah, lack of knowing.
I guess that didn't tie in as well as I thought it did.
Not as well, but it's a good point to make, because just like those discussions where we have to think about like our schedules and what we want to do with our day, not knowing what it will be in the future is unsettling for a lot of people. Some people don't think of things until the minute before, but for someone like you and I would say the vast majority of the world, we like to plan things quite far in advance. And I would argue the business world forces that, having to give 2 weeks notice, or scheduling 2 weeks out, or thinking about when you want to take vacation 6 months out.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. It's more further, and you have to guess, really.
Yes.
Because you can't predict.
That is why the current situation is so devastating, especially for us participating in band. Our director has stated that a band director always knows 6 months out what he's going to be doing, what the band's going to be doing. And this would apply to sports as well. This would apply there too.
Yeah, I mean, we would get our schedule for July in December, January usually.
So,
and that schedule would run like exact times and all the way through October.
Oh yeah.
Down to the detail.
And so especially when you're used to having something like that, having that taken away and not